So, I get to be in between the TV star and the Hall of Fame two-time Super Bowl winning quarterback. And in between the TV star and the Super Bowl winning quarterback, you guys get the professor. Sorry, and I feel a lot like a professor, actually, because I'm not getting any love from the front row. It's exactly like every undergrad classroom I've ever lectured in, right? That's okay. That's all right. We'll deal with it. But I think what's interesting about this is I've got a core message to share with you that represents sort of how we as organizations bring about a lot of what Jason talked about, and also deal with some of the changes that are happening to us. One of the biggest ones being that weird generation, starts with an M, we treat their name like a four-letter word. And we do, don't we? And what is going to change as the millennial generation and whatever comes after them, Gen Z, and then I guess we'll start over, Gen A, B, C, D, et cetera, and how those shifts are going to also change how we lead, how we manage, and especially how we manage to bring about innovation. And so to tee it up, I want to give you the core thought right away, and then we'll prove it in a couple different examples and a couple different practices. The core thought is this: that great leaders don't innovate the product, they innovate the factory. Great leaders don't just innovate the product. Sure, we need innovative products and services. There's a lot of amazing technologies that Jason shared about and that you guys spend every single day studying. And then a lot of them are mind-blowing and amazing, and most of them are the product themselves of an innovation to the factory. And I use factory here as a metaphor for any place where work gets done. The reason I choose the word factory is that this has been true ever since most people were working in factories. It was true over 100 years ago when arguably the world's first management consultant set up shop. His name, you might remember him if you took a Principles of Management class. I have to drill it into the heads of my undergraduates. His name was Frederick Winslow Taylor, and the first act of management consulting happened when Bethlehem Iron Works contacted Frederick Taylor. And they said, we have a problem. Well, and actually, they had two problems. The first was that their name was Bethlehem Iron Works and that they made steel. Kind of a branding problem. But simple name change, they had a much bigger problem, which was that they were making less and less of it every year. They were getting less and less orders in, less and less business. So they came to Frederick Taylor and essentially said, how can we do more with less? And Taylor brought some ideas and an infamous stopwatch to their factory and began to tinker and experiment. And what he would do is he studied the entire production process of making steel, and he studied the most efficient workers at each stage in the process, and he timed them for norms, and then he said, this is the standard, and we're going to start incentivizing towards that standard. If you can complete your task this many times in a day, you're going to get extra money, and if you can't, you're going to get paid a little bit less. We're moving from hourly to the piece rate system. And this dramatically increased production, not just because of the incentives, but also because everybody was trained on the perfect way that this ideal laborer was doing it. In fact, Taylor actually presented his ideas once at the World's Fair in Paris, and it was the most watched attraction. People were lining up to watch big burly American guys from Pennsylvania make steel. Right? Not exactly It's a Small World After All and all of the other things we think about when we think about the World's Fair, but it was the most popular attraction at the time. And at the core of Taylor's ideas was one simple philosophy. He said it in his first book, Principles of Scientific Management, which was actually a series of lectures. After he was the world's first management consultant, he became a professor. And he traveled the world giving lectures on his ideas. And I think this one quote encapsulates his ideas about what shifted and innovated the factory. He said, the duty of enforcing the adoption of standards and enforcing cooperation. This cooperation rests with the management alone. I'll take that from 1913 and bring it into 2017. In other words, Taylor believed that in order to efficiently manage a factory, you needed two tiers of employees. You needed management, and their job was to think, their job was to know what to do, their job was to train people on what to do, and then you needed labor, and their job was not to think, their job was just to do. Management would bring the brains, labor would bring the brawn. And as long as it was simple, repetitive tasks, the system worked really, really well. But there's a problem with this system. This system is what helped sort of kickstart the last bit of the Industrial Revolution, what brought a lot of prosperity, especially in manufacturing in the early 1900s, to the United States. Taylor himself, his ideas spread all over the world and did the same thing as they moved throughout the world. Taylor's book, Principles of Scientific Management, still in print after 100 years. As an author, if that happens, New York Times bestseller lists aside, I would just rather see it still in print 100 years from now, right? Moreover, what I think is interesting is In Print is a magazine. Originally, two fans, devotees of Frederick Taylor, started a magazine called Systems. And Systems adapted, morphed, got bought by a bunch of people. Today, it's known as Bloomberg Business Week. Taylor was never on the cover of Business Week. He's just the reason we have Business Week. So I think it's interesting to see how much this idea that there's management and there's labor, and these are two different classes, has spread throughout the world. There's a story actually of Taylor's grandchildren going to Japan, and the Japanese executives at various factories bowed lower to his grandchildren than they expected to be bowed at. In other words, in the Japanese culture, we're respecting you and we're elevating you to a level of superiority just because of who your grandfather was, right? The great sort of Frederick Taylor. There's a problem, though, with Taylor's ideas as they spread throughout the world. And it's, if you haven't already put your finger on it, it's that most of us don't work in steel mills anymore. Most of us don't work in physical factories. We've moved from a physical factory to what I call an idea factory. You know, most of us now, it's not same repetitive task day in and day out. Our job is to solve problems, solve customer problems, solve internal problems, to invent processes and come up with creative ideas. And the way that we manage that is a whole lot different than when there's a simple set of repetitive tasks that have to happen every day. And yet what we see when we look across a lot of management literature is the same sort of regurgitated Frederick Taylor advice for a situation that calls for radical problem solving and radical creativity. If you want to take some of the ideas you heard about in the earlier session this morning and start sort of putting them into practice, you can't make this assumption anymore that just management knows what to do and and the labor level just executes on it. Everybody's job is now coming up with ideas and solving problems, whether it be for the company, for the client, or both. And so we need to shift a little bit about how we manage in that environment. So today I'm going to present to you 5 ideas, actually 6, because I was going to do 5, and now we got to talk about your email inbox. But five ideas that represent the future of management, and a 6th bonus idea on how to cope with it. In other words, what to do about your smartphone. 6 ideas, and I'm going to present them in an order of sort of the flow of talent. So we no longer, most of us don't work in physical factories, and even the ones that are in the United States, most of them are so technologically advanced that Taylor probably wouldn't even recognize them. And so these represent the flow of talent, much like an assembly line, the flow of talent through an organization, because that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to innovate the factory. And the first refers to how do we even bring people into an organization? It's how do we hire? I believe I'm seeing a lot of organizations that are turning the hiring process over to a team. And in order to kind of explain what I mean by turning it over to a team, let's talk about what the normal hiring process, the normal way that we get talent is. You know, in the normal hiring process, it looks kind of like this. It usually starts with a phone call, right? And it's funny as my undergraduate students get really nervous about these phone calls, and I try and explain to them, no, this phone call is just to make sure that you're not crazy and you're not a felon and you're not lying on your resume, right? That you are who you say you are and that it's a fit and that you actually want to work there. And if all of that is passed, we bring you in for that sort of first face-to-face interview. About an hour long. You interact with the person that will probably be your future manager. And if you and she get along, then everything is great. They might bring you back for a second round interview, either with that person and another person, or that person's boss. I actually a lot of times describe the interview process today much like the ancient processes of courtship. Right? First there's got to be an interpersonal connection, and then you've got to meet the parents. Right? So, but we do all of this. We do it in the span of, if we added up all of the face-to-face hours, it might be 3 hours, maybe 4 hours that we've interacted with this person and we've decided there's a fit. And then we hire them, we bring them into our organization. And how many of you have ever been in that situation where they just don't work out? It looked like a great fit on paper, there was a connection, and they're just not performing the way that we thought they were performing. It's funny, I'm watching a lot of head nods, and it reminds me of a couple weeks ago. I was speaking to a group of bankers. I asked the same question, and every head nodded in the room, and I thought for a minute, I went, if there was ever a room that should know that past performance is not indicative of future results, it's that industry, right? I mean, in the same way here, if there ever were a group that know that there's a lot of variables that come into play, and what happens in the future, it accounts for a million different variables that are all sort of hard to tease out, it's us, right? And yet we do this and we're surprised. But there's a lot of organizations that are experiencing less and less of those fit problems, those people not just working out. And it's because they're turning their hiring process over to teams. So to give you an example, we'll leave this room visually and we'll go to the floors of a Whole Foods market, excuse me. We'll talk about the way that they hire. If you were looking for a job at Whole Foods, whether in the store or in any of the regional or headquarters offices, you would be interviewing for the job, much the same in the beginning. So phone interview or first face-to-face interview, then you might meet with a couple people, then they bring you in, and then you work in your role for, depending on the role, 30 to 60 days, and then the team that you're on votes on whether or not you get to stay. Now, if you're thinking to yourself, this sounds a lot like Survivor, it's for good reason. It's exactly like Survivor. It's exactly like Survivor. The team votes on whether or not you stay, and if they decide, it takes a 2/3 majority vote to get you to stay, and if they decide that you're not a fit, then the store manager or the regional manager, whomever is responsible for placing you on that team, has a judgment call to make. They either find a new team for you, or they, I'm trying to think of a nice way to say it, invite you to be successful somewhere else, some other company. They share you with their competition, right? You're out. And what I think is interesting about this is that the reason they do this is that Whole Foods as an organization runs on teams. If you get hired, one of the first documents that you'll see is their declaration of interdependence. They run on teams at the store level, at the regional level, and even at the senior level. In fact, John Mackey, the sort of figurehead of Whole Foods, is actually just the co-CEO. There's a 3-person sort of senior leadership team that functions normally as the chief executive. John Mackey actually says about this process, he says a team doesn't fully gel until it doesn't vote somebody on the team. A team doesn't fully gel until it doesn't vote somebody on the team. That's interesting. So in other words, we're not really a team until we vote somebody off the island, right? Now, what is he saying in that? Because it seems like this would be a really uncomfortable process. Well, what he's saying is that a team can declare they have all sorts of standards and accountabilities and values. You can put as many pretty pictures and fun sayings on the wall as you want. But until somebody you've brought into that team is failing to meet up to those expectations, and you, what did I say earlier, invite them to be successful somewhere else, until you do that, you haven't actually landed at what your standard is. You can claim your standards up here, but if you're letting somebody stay when they're down here, your standard's down here, right? You can fool yourself with as many pretty pictures as you want. Your standard is here. And so a team doesn't fully gel until they say, we had to make the hard choice to invite somebody to leave our team because they weren't living up to the accountability that the rest of the team holds themselves to. Now, the reason this works beyond just the accountability, if I can permit you to get a little nerdy, I am a professor after all, I want to tell you about a research study, an almost 10-year research study that kind of explains why this hiring process is so effective inside of organizations that are adopting it. I want to tell you about the research of a man named Boris Grossberg, which, by the way, is the ultimate professor name, Boris Grossberg. You can picture the elbow patches, can't you? Boris Grossberg, brilliant researcher at Harvard Business School, incredibly nice man, and did a fascinating study of Wall Street institutional investment analysts. So these are the people that study an industry, study or a couple, 2 or 3 companies in that industry, and write reports that institutional investors use to make high-level investment decisions. So he studied over 1,000 analysts over a 9-year period of time, and he was particularly interested in their transfers, and I'll tell you about that in a moment. But he studied them at 24 different investment banks and then did over 150 hours of interviews with people that had transferred from one firm to another. So here's the situation. There's a magazine inside the industry. It's a trade publication called Institutional Investor. And every year, Institutional Investor surveys the high-level institutional investors that are reading these reports from different analysts and asks them who in each industry, who in each sector is the most effective, the best analyst. And they rank them. And 1, 2, 3 in an honorable mention. And you can imagine if you get ranked in this publication, these are people who are making hundreds of thousands, sometimes billions of dollar investment decisions after they read your report. You can imagine when that group of people says you're the best in town, the phone rings, right? And it's not you dialing out to them for a phone interview, it's other people inviting you in, headhunters trying to get you to transfer over. Because if ever there were a job, if ever there were an industry where your individual knowledge, your individual talent, we could just pick it up and put it somewhere else, it sounds like it's this job, right? But what fascinated Grossberg was that that's not what was happening. What was happening was that as people were getting hired over to new firms, the performance of these stars was actually declining. There were 3 consequences when stars moved over. The first was that performance declined. They fell off the rankings. In some cases, it took upwards of 5 years to get back ranked an institutional investor. The team that new star was put on, also their performance declined. And the overall valuation of the company actually decreased after these major acquisitions. Makes sense, right? If you're paying someone $1 million a year to come over to your firm because they ranked highly in this publication and then they're dropping off and their advice isn't seen as valuable, you could see how that would affect the bottom line pretty readily. And these are fascinating consequences because they didn't apply uniformly across every transfer. There was one type of transfer in which this performance drop didn't happen. Lift-outs. Lift-outs are when an investment bank said, okay, you're a star player, you're doing amazing work, we're going to take your entire team and we're going to set them up over in our offices. In other words, all of the people that helped you execute that star performance, all of the resources that they provide, the culture that they provide, we're just going to transplant that over. Instead of just taking you and throwing you on a new team and hoping it works out. So you think about this lift-outs idea. You might not be able to just pull whole teams of people, although one of the most interesting HR policies I'm seeing out of the world of Silicon Valley and tech is the Aqua Hire. Have you heard about this? The Aqua Hire, where a company will pay to buy a smaller startup company just because they like the engineers that are working on it. I believe it was Square. It was one of Jack Dorsey's companies, recently paid $3 million for this social networking app called Yik Yak. If you've never heard of it, it's okay, because you're under 25, or unless you're under 25, you've never used it. They paid $3 million for it because there were 5 engineers on the team that they wanted to bring in, right? That's a lift-out. You might not be able to do a lift-out, but if you think about the Whole Foods process, or you think about any other time where you're using the team to solicit hiring advice, you're kind of feeling out for whether or not this would be similar to a lift-out, right? If the people who are on the team are putting influence into whether or not they're a fit for this person, then you can get a good sense as to whether or not this is going to work out, whether or not this person's new team is like their old team. It might not be as effective as a total lift out, but it can help sort of negate those false positives that we were all talking about, the past performance not equaling future result, if we know that the future team they'll be playing on will be similar. See, Grossberg research reveals that team talent is one of the most potent influences on individual performance. We love to think that we are star players, that talent is individual, and we just need to find that great person. But in reality, in 2017, in a knowledge or creative work economy, so much of our performance depends on how well we interact with the team around us. And they're not the only company. A company named Automatic. This is a fascinating company. They make WordPress software. I guarantee you at some point today you have been on a website that runs on WordPress because they power a quarter of the internet. You might not ever know it, and then you might not actually transfer back that it's this Automatic company. They're a very private company. But they use a system they call trials. They go through the normal interview process, and then if someone seems like a fit, they don't make an offer, they get a chance to try out for their position. They come on as a contractor for 6 to 8 weeks. They work with a team on real problems. They talk to real customers if they're in a customer service role. They develop real code if they're in an engineering role. And at the end of that period of time, the team gathers all of their feedback about how it works and gives that to the hiring manager who has the final decision. Matt Mullenweg, the CEO and founder of Automatic, actually often still makes the final decision. And this, I love this. He wants to do a final round interview, but he does it via chat, like texting or Skype chat, or if you're old school enough, like AOL or CompuServe chat rooms. Right? He doesn't want to interact with the person face to face. He doesn't want to be biased by his own tendency to like or click with certain people. He just cares about whether or not they click with the team. They click with the team and he can talk with them and it sounds good, this is great, and we make the offer. Now you might not be able to do voting people off the team or trials. There might be legal reasons sometimes or just HR departments that you can't win fights with to create this new class of employee. But there are still things that you can do. I really like the way that Google, I've tried to write 2 books now without mentioning Google, I apologize. They're sort of the cliche super tech innovation company. But one of the things that they do is they've just created their whole interview process around teams. So you will interview with, you'll do the initial resume screen, do a remote interview, then you'll interview with hiring manager, peers, cross-functional managers, and this one I love, interviews with future subordinates. In other words, we're bringing you in for one role, but we recognize that if we do our job right, you are one day going to be a leader in this organization. Let's interview with the type of people that you would be leading to see if there's a fit there, to see if 2 or 3 years down the road, you're still a good choice. And all of that committee feedback gets put together and gets handed to one of the 2 CEOs, still does the interview before it's over, final decision, right? So now we're not doing trials, but we're still soliciting a whole group's worth of feedback. Unless you think this is just sort of a technology and organic market type of situation, I'll tell you about this company, Steelscape. They make steel. They make steel, not unlike Frederick Taylor. They run through pre-employment screenings and pre-orientation, so they train everybody sort of on what they're going to do, and then they sit you down in a room with the people you're going to do it with. There is someone from HR there, but they're just there to make sure nothing crazy goes down. Right? But everyone in the company is trained on how to be a good interviewer, and the team that you're going to be working with is the panel that you interview with. In all of these cases, what all of these have in common when it refers to the influx of talent, which is, after all, one of the most important decisions you can make about whether the future of your firm will keep innovating, is the people who are the future of your firm. All of those rest on the same assumption, that the people who work with new hires should be the ones deciding on whether or not they're hired. So now once you bring in those people, you also have to think about where they're going to go in two places. One, in the organizational chart, and how that works, and two, where they're going to go in the physical space. And so I'm going to present to you a couple radical ideas for how we interact once they're on the team. I'm actually going to encourage you to put customers second. You know this phrase, the customer is always right, unless you're United Airlines? You've heard that, right? Or really any airline at this point. Admit it, we kind of like, every time we see one of those in social media, we just assume who it was. A couple weeks ago it was American, and I was shocked. Right? Why isn't it this? But no, what I mean by that is certainly not that. What I mean by putting customers second is a realization that a lot of senior leaders are having in a variety of firms. Most of them all have the same organizational chart. It looks something like this, right? Lines and boxes, pyramid. There's a lot more roles on the bottom than there are on the top. And this works really, really well for a couple reasons. It works really well for the downward communication of information when we need to communicate, when we need to change plans quickly. The senior leaders communicating that plan, it works really, really well. It also works really well for holding lower level employees accountable up through an organization. So it works really, really well for accountability. But there are times, maybe an airplane ride from Chicago to Louisville, there are times where these systems and the processes of accountability still fail. And one of my favorite CEOs in business today, or actually he's an ex-CEO now, but over the last 10 years or so, is Vinette Nair, the CEO of HLC Technologies, a technology company. And he had this cathartic moment one day when he had back-to-back meetings with clients, two very different meetings, right? The first meeting was an attempt to reconcile a huge client contract. They do IT consulting and services, and this client was essentially ending their agreement because they were disappointed with the level of service they got. And so in comes the CEO trying to sort of solve everything, and the client looks right at the CEO and goes, "Why are you here? They did a fantastic job. They were amazing. They did everything they could. It was your company that kept them from doing what we needed them to do. You guys held them back and wouldn't allow them to do the things that we needed to do. It was your fault. Why are you here? I need them. I don't need you." And that's a pretty interesting way to start your morning, right? I'd much rather watch amazing videos of the future of technology than start my morning that way. This afternoon conversation was very different. Clients super pleased, wanted to extend out their contract, and they said, "Look, I want you to know your people that we worked with on this project are amazing. I wish everyone in your company was that way." Whew, that's a hard day. And what Vinette Nair realized was that he was thinking about the organizational chart all wrong, because what's not on this picture is what he titled the value zone. He described the value zone as any zone where a person from our organization interacts with a customer. That is, after all, where all value in the organization is created. There are other departments where value is preserved and where value might be maximized, but it's the interaction between whoever is the face of the company and the customer where all value is created. And he realized to properly leverage these customer interactions and to properly create more value, he needed to do something fairly radical with his organizational chart. He needed to flip it upside down. He needed information to go both ways, and he needed accountability to go both ways. He needed to put employees first so that they could put their customers first. So in the mind of senior leadership now, customers are second. Employees are first, we're putting them first, and we're allowing them to hold us accountable to get the resources that we need so that they can put customers first. I admit it's kind of a trick. You don't actually put customers second, but you do put your employees for frontline value zone employees first so that they can put customers first. Now, what Vinette Nair saw after they did this flip, imagine he called a meeting of some of their biggest customers and he announced them this plan. We're going to put you second. We're making changes to be able to provide more and to be held accountable more to the performance of the people you interact with. Eventually he got an applause, but you can imagine the gasp in the room when he first announced it. But it worked. Over time, customer loyalty went up, the profits inside the company went up dramatically, and the professors in the room and the professors who study this are like, oh, no surprise. This was a finding actually from about 40 years ago that no one pays attention to because it's in the ivory tower. It was a finding called the service profit chain. This happened about 40 years ago. A group of professors, mostly from Harvard, but from other Boston-based business schools, were looking at what predicts profits. Now, if you remember, if you can think back, this was at a time where the consensus of business consultants and even a lot of academics was that market share predicted profitability. There were consultants saying, go ahead and take a loss on your product for 2 or 3 years. You'll eventually get dominant market share, economies of scale kick in, and you'll be profitable. Which works really well when you're a consultant, because 2 years later you can come back and go, oh, so you're not profitable. Well, that's fine. We've got a new 4-box model to sell you. Here's a PowerPoint. And so this cycle of this, almost this sort of Albert Einstein would call it insanity cycle, right, kicked in so many times that they started to ask, all right, clearly there's a faulty assumption here. And they wanted to know what predicts profits. What's the number one predictor of profits in an organization? They found that it was customer loyalty. In other words, repeat business from customers. Well, what predicts customer loyalty? Well, there's actually a couple other links in between these two, but the gist of it is customer loyalty is affected by satisfaction after every interaction. Customer satisfaction is predicted by employee satisfaction. And what predicts employee satisfaction? Vignette in a year figured it out, putting employees first. In other words, making them feel like they actually have the autonomy, the power, the authority to do the things they need to do to put customers first. Now, a warning here. What happens if you put employees first and they don't put customers first? Well, you pull a survivor. And you invite them to be successful somewhere else. It doesn't mean that there's no accountability to those employees anymore. It just means that accountability and information flows need to go back and forth both ways. But the core employees who are in that value zone need to know that you've got their back so that they can have the backs of the customers. Howard Schultz, the CEO two-time CEO of Starbucks, actually started, and then he came in as chairman. He came back to the CEO role to solve a crisis. He puts it this way, and I love this. He said, I do not believe that shareholder value is sustainable if you're not creating value for the people who are doing the work. He doesn't use the term value zone here, but that's essentially what he's saying, is that creating shareholder value is the result of value created for the customer in the value zone. So this is where employees go in the organizational chart, especially employees in the value zone. We put them first, we hold ourselves accountable to them, hold them accountable to us. It's a mutual relationship so that they can put customers first. So that's where they go in the org chart. Let's talk about where they go in the office. There's a trend moving forward. It's been going for about 30 years, and I'm not the biggest fan of it. In fact, I want to close most open office environments. Not necessarily close, but dramatically modify. I said there's a trend. This trend really sort of began, I trace it back to actually Michael Bloomberg becoming the mayor of New York City. If you remember the story, one of the first things he did was tear down a bunch of walls. He created this infamous bullpen. Bloomberg would sit in the center, and then all of the other people that he needed to interact with on a daily basis sat in this big open office. You can imagine the noise going on in this room. But Bloomberg swore that it was positive, and studies would actually show that these open office plans, these bullpen plans, would lead to a dramatic cost savings. That's probably the real reason, by the way, that a lot of people were for these open offices, cost savings. But increases in collaboration and communication among people. There were some studies that suggested increases in productivity. But everything we do is a trade-off. Everything is cost-benefit, right? And often in talking about these things and popularizing these things, I actually lost track of how many articles I could find about Silicon Valley or in New York, Silicon Alley or other tech firms were looking at them and going, well, they have these big open offices, and so we need that too. And we mythologize a lot of these stories, like Steve Jobs and the creation of the Steve Jobs building at Pixar, which was this one really big open hallway where all of these serendipitous collaborations happen. What they don't tell you is that people then from that big hallway go back to their own individual offices, but more on that later. We're not looking at this sort of negative side, because here's the unbiased picture of all of these studies. We also see decreases in satisfaction, in job satisfaction. We see decreases and increases in stress in the relationship, so decreases in the quality of the relationship. We just see decreases in overall performance, and my favorite is increases in stress, right? If you're constantly surrounded by all of these different voices, all of these different things that are distracting you, right? You can't really focus in and do the work that really creates value. Now, the millennials have got this figured out. It's why they wear those frickin' earbuds, right? And we get super annoyed at them, but they're just trying to cope with the environment that we threw them in. I suppose if they're sitting in like an office with a closed door and they're still wearing earbuds, then okay, that one's just rude. But they're trying to cope with this decreases in stress. My favorite study actually shows that people who work in an open office floor plan are more likely to call in sick to work. Now, the study didn't ask if they were legitimately sick or if they were just sick of their office, but I think it's still pretty telling, right? That they would more likely to call in sick for work. And what I mean by this is that it's all a cost benefit. But I don't believe that the benefits are outweighing the costs. The cost savings are not really offset by increases in productivity. It seems to be going the other way. There's one universal, though, in every single study that either mitigates an open office floor plan. You might not be able to change yours if you've got one. You might not be able to. It's actually kind of funny. I'll tell you a personal story. As we were writing this, it was my book editor that strongly encouraged me to finish this chapter. And I was like, I don't know if I want to include it in the book and blah, blah, blah. And he goes, no, you've got to finish. You've got to finish. I said, okay, why are you pushing this so much? He goes, well, because they've announced in about 6 months we're going to an open office, and I want to be able to take your chapter to them and argue against it. So you might not be able to argue against it, right? But one of the things I think is interesting is that across all of the studies, the one consistent finding, tried and true every single time, all of these others go up and down, is that a sense of control over one's environment, a sense that they can change the environment or that they can move to different environments to do different type of work, a sense of autonomy over where we do the work dramatically increases performance without any of these stress or sickness trade-offs. So whether you move to an open office, or I actually really like what Gearson Lerman Group, they're a consulting firm in New York City, does. They have about 150 employees, and they have an office that seats 210. And the reason they do it is that they want a variety of different workplaces and a variety of different environments so that you can pick up and go somewhere else. If you decide you need a conference room, you can get a conference room. If you decide you need a single little stall that you can hide in and do focused work, that's great too. Whatever you decide is what we'll do. Now, a lot of companies are saying, oh, we can't do this. Our offices are what they are, but they're actually allowing companies or employees to expense co-working space memberships. Okay, so if this is too distracting and too many people are bothering you, you can go hide somewhere else. I think it's actually not that bad. It's not a bad solution to not being able to overhaul the entire environment. But the point is, whatever we do, I think this speaks to the need, especially when we're dealing with employees, to separate out presence from performance and take a level of trust that if we give them autonomy over where they do the work, where in the building sometimes, or where in the city sometimes they're doing the work, holding them accountable to getting the work done for sure, but giving them a sense of autonomy over where they do it, we can see dramatic increases. On this note too, let's actually stop here and talk a bit about the slides. I know I'm not allowed to press the blank button, but if you want to blank out for me, I want to talk to you about the virtual version of this, which is your email inbox. Right? How many of you have a smartphone on you? Just out of curiosity, how many of you have checked your phone since I started talking? It's okay, we're all friends here, right? I get it. Some people are ratting out each other, like, this guy did it 2 times, I saw it. I think this is a fascinating concept because we knew this was coming and we still agreed to it. Here's what I mean by that, right? 2007, Steve Jobs debuts the iPhone, Android, Samsung, everybody follows pretty quickly after that. We lapped it up. We loved the idea that we could play Angry Birds on something that makes phone calls, right? But we didn't really think about the work implications, and we had all of the warning signs for how stressed we feel now, right? Why? Because before there was a smartphone, there was one device that could do that. Do you remember one device that could make phone calls and check email? What was it called? What was it also called? The Crackberry, right? We knew what we were getting ourselves into. If you have a smartphone on you, and you've set up your email, for example, you are by default taking your work home with you every single night. If you think about it that way, it doesn't sound as cool. I mean, Angry Birds is still kind of cool, but it doesn't sound that cool. And what we find is that a lot of it stems from people resulting to the defaults, right? The default of how many times it checks in a day, the default of how many times Outlook checks in a day. This isn't actually just about bringing work home with you at night. It's also about trying to have focus and do what my friend Cal Newport calls deep work, the actual focused work that creates value for an organization. The studies show if you get interrupted in that deep work, it takes about 15 to 20 minutes to get back to the mental level of focus that you were at. Now, the default on Outlook is to check for email every 5 minutes. So you might have whole days where you feel super productive, and then you realize all you did was clear out your inbox. You ever had one of those days? It's because we're going to these defaults. And there's a lot of organizations that are setting up new defaults. Some of them are doing away with email entirely, right, or trying to. My favorite company, Atos, a 70,000 person French IT company, is striving to be a zero email company. They're not there yet, but they've reduced their internal email by about 60%. And they've seen increases in productivity, decreases in administrative costs, and a lot of benefits from that. Others, one of my favorite policies is trying to get people a little more time to rest when they're off work. Right? So some companies will shut the email server off at 6 p.m. And you can, if you're that type of person that's like, you know what, my kids are grown, or I never had them focused on work, or I put them, if I balancing work and life, I put them to bed and then I come back at 10. If you're that person, fine. It's just going to stay in your outbox until 8 a.m. the next morning when we turn the servers back on. My absolute favorite policy is Daimler organization, their European organization, has a policy they call mail on holiday. Get this is amazing. It works like a normal autoresponder, except that when you get the email reads, hello, I'm on holiday, I'll be back on such and such day, and I won't see your email when I return because it's already been deleted. If it's important, you can contact this person, and if it's not, please email me back on that day. And as a result, their employees aren't coming back to the day, yeah, sounds good, a lot of people are like, I gotta tweak that. People aren't coming back to the deluge of emails. I mean, admit it, a lot of us take our laptops on family vacations because we just don't want 1,000 emails when we return. But are we actually all that effective when we're on vacation? And are we all that rested so we can come back and be effective when we come back? No. The same thing happens from day to day in work. So other organizations are saying, okay, that's not necessarily the problem, but the problem is that people are checking their email all day and they're not actually doing the deep work. So we're going to set no email times from 10 to 2 during the day. Just don't send email. Use old school technologies like the phone, or standing up and walking 2 cubicles down to where the person you were sending the email to is, right? Really old school stuff. And it's working really well. One of my favorite studies compared the decreases in stress from limiting email during the workday to decreases in stress from teaching employees deep breathing relaxation techniques, right? And mental meditation, et cetera, return to the breath meditation. And the study authors actually say that the results were the same, whether you limit email or whether you learn how to go to your happy place. It's all the same. So limiting email might not actually take you to your Zen Nirvana place, but it's just as good as being there, right? I want that. I want that in my focus. So I also want to talk to you as we move forward, and we can bring the slides back up. I want to talk to you about how we're giving feedback as well. Okay, I've already got some fans already on this one. This is interesting. And I've already got some doubters. That's okay. I'm used to it. There's a lot of organizations, and this is a trend I think we're at the beginning of. We're not going to see 100% saturation, but we're going to see a lot of organizations, especially ones that recruit top talent, are actually doing away with performance appraisals. They're throwing performance appraisals in the trash. And when you first think about this, it doesn't make any sense. Because the goal of a performance appraisal is feedback, and feedback improves performance, and feedback allows employees to be more productive, to think better, et cetera. So why would throwing it in the trash do anything? Well, it depends on what you replace it with. So Adobe, for example, Adobe makers of Acrobat, Photoshop, you probably use an Adobe product today, especially if you were checking your email while I was talking to read a PDF, like you're using an Adobe product. Adobe went through a dramatic shift, a technological shift a couple of years ago. Do you remember, so when Adobe first started, they were like most companies. Do you remember when you used to have to buy software in a box? Do you remember that? It was like a cereal box that had Windows 95 on it, and you go and it was a floppy. Do you remember floppy disks actually? Do you remember those? This was like way before AOL was spamming all of us with CDs in the mail, right? This was way back when you had to buy cereal box software. Adobe, a lot of organizations were still working on that. We're doing a yearly update, and we debug the software, but we also load it with a bunch of bugs, so we have something to fix for Windows 97. You know what I mean. And they switched to a subscription service, to the idea that you're working in the cloud on our software that's constantly updating based on your feedback. And that led them to start asking, what else are we doing on an annual basis that might be better if we're doing it on an ongoing one? And the number one thing employees took aim at was their performance appraisal system. It said once a year it doesn't necessarily work. It turns into just people lobbying to get the right rating. The feedback's not all that effective. And so they did away with it and they replaced it with a system. They took all of the hours that managers and senior leaders were spending doing this paperwork and they taught them how to coach. They replaced it with a system they called check-ins. Check-in is really simple. What I love about check-ins is even if you can't change whatever performance appraisal system you're using, you can layer it on top of that system and make the performance appraisal more effective as well. So a check-in works like this. It's any informal conversation, can be as little as 10 minutes, happens every quarter, every month, usually not more frequently than a month. As long as 3 things are talked about in the same conversation, it's a check-in. Expectations, feedback, and growth and development. Expectations is the setting, tracking, and reviewing of clear objectives. So what are you working on right now? What am I holding you accountable to? But also, what are you holding me accountable to get you? Feedback is okay, let's talk about this last interval. How well did you do, but also how well did I do as your manager, giving you the things you needed to do to be effective? And then growth and development, the opportunity to talk about opportunities. The opportunity to talk. So in other words, where are we going as a company? Where do you see yourself going? Remember, this is an informal conversation. This part of the conversation very rarely gets documented. And the reason is that, as I'll tell you in a moment, sometimes people choose that where I need to go to grow professionally is somewhere else. We'll talk about how to deal with that in a moment. But even if we don't, just the idea that on a more frequent basis we're having this growth conversation is hugely motivating. I'll teach you the little professor, organizational professor secret. We talk a lot about incentives as a way to leverage motivation. Incentives, monetary bonuses, award trips, all sorts of other stock options, they're all what we call extrinsic motivators. And they're easy, which is why most organizations do them. But they very rarely are more potent than intrinsic motivators. Reasons people show up to work for their own. And one of the most potent intrinsic motivators, the single most effective motivator of employees, do you know what it is? It's progress. It's the idea that I'm making progress in my career, that I'm contributing to a company that's making progress, that we are going somewhere. I mean, that's probably why a lot of you were so enthralled by Jason's talk this morning, that you're seeing the technological process. We, as a society, are going somewhere. It's invigorating. It's exciting. People are the same way. We want to know that there is some path forward in this job. And if you can't show that to us, and we can't have that conversation, then we end up really relating to like Dilbert and Office Space and The Office and all of those things where we feel like we're trapped. Now, do you know what the best part about progress is, by the way? It's free. The conversation about growth and development just takes time. You don't have to plan an award trip to Hawaii or major quarterly bonuses. It's free. As long as you're having this conversation about expectations, feedback, and growth and development, you're providing people a hugely motivating process while also providing them the feedback they need to improve performance. And so when Adobe implemented this system, they saw dramatic increases in morale. They saw decreases in employee quitting, but I love this one, increases in involuntary departures. In other words, Whole Foods, voting people off the island, right? Involuntary departures means inviting someone to be successful somewhere else. On an annual system, you could slack off for like 11 months and we wouldn't catch it. Now we catch it on a monthly basis and you're gone. Increases in productivity, increases in revenue. It's been a smashing success for Adobe, and more organizations are following through. They might not be doing check-ins, but they're doing some system of ongoing feedback. And the reason this is working is simply perspective, right? When we talk about an annual review, we're talking about giving someone feedback on how they're doing from 12 months ago or 11 months ago, or what happens far more often, from the last 3 months, but pretending it's from a year ago. It's not a close enough perspective to really give people the feedback they need to improve their performance. It's kind of like, imagine playing like the first half of a football game and then reading the not knowing the score at the end of the half till like next week. How do you make changes mid-fly? How do you, I don't know, come back from 21 points into the greatest comeback in Super Bowl history? I don't know. How do you, really? No one's a Pats fan. I got one Pats fan. All right. No, I guess this really isn't the wrong place to roll that joke out, actually. All right, lesson learned. So it's like that. Imagine being able to provide real-time feedback to change things on the fly. Then you could create performance comebacks like that. So if you switch from annual to one-on-one informal discussions, you can do that. The other reason is think about, remember the M word, the millennials word, and where the need to change how we manage is going. If you think about that generation, this is a generation that could just keep trying and keep playing the game again and again and again, and their character would die and you just play it again. You don't have to load a new quarter in, right? So you can experiment and try and get constant feedback. Plugged into a school system that's testing them every 4 weeks sometimes, right? Giving them quarterly and mid-year and third quarter and fourth quarter report cards, and then even little feedback surveys in between that, right? Going into, in my realm, a lot of college courses now, we use a learning management system that keeps a real-time updated grade on how you're doing, that you could just keep checking in. And you take that, this generation that's grown up getting constant feedback, and you plug them into a system that gives it to them once a year, how's that working for you? It's not going to work very well. And so whether you abandon, pull an Adobe and abandon the system, or whether you take responsibility for sort of your team and go, look, I can't change the system, but what I can do is commit to starting to have these check-ins, expectations, feedback, growth and development conversations with all of my people. Then at the end of a year, when you have to do that annual review, nothing is a surprise. It's just another conversation and an ongoing feedback conversation. It's my favorite takeaway from all of these different ideas, because anybody can do it, whether HR lets you or not. Right? You might not be able to ditch the performance review, but everyone can benefit from learning how to have these conversations. And if you're in a situation where you're like, oh, this would be great, I want to do it with my team, but I also want to receive it, you can train people on how to do it. Or you can, it's a pretty simple template to use. Now, the one weird thing you're going to find is that as you do this, right, people are going to have that growth and development conversation, and they're going to talk about how their path to growth might involve leaving. Their path to growth might involve going somewhere else. And what we're seeing a lot of organizations do right now is actually celebrating departures, treating employees like alumni. And it turns out one of the best ways to be a great place to work is to be a great place to have worked. So the reason for this is, especially in most hierarchical organizations, whether you flip them upside down or not, most of them are up or out anyway. But yet we still act really surprised when someone leaves, right? We still have this mentality that at the end, that you choose a company and you work there for 40 years, and then we give you a pension and a gold watch, even though it's 2017, and the average tenure is about 5 years, and it's like a gold-plated watch. And a funny thing about your pension, we live in a different system now, and yet we still sort of treat these as betrayals. People who decide they want to leave get the security guard in the box. Anybody here ever gotten the security guard in the box? You know what I'm talking about? I got the virtual version of the security guard in the box once. I worked for a geographically dispersed firm. I sent an email with my 2 weeks resignation to my boss. I was going back to grad school. I was going to be a professor. He called me about 45 minutes later, and he started talking to me about the checkout procedures. And I could tell he was reading. And I interrupted him. I said, Dustin, you're just reading. Why don't you just email me this whole thing and I can check it off over the next 2 weeks? And he said, oh, no. We shut off your email server 37 minutes ago. I got the virtual version of the security guard in the box, right? And I believe this is truly a mistake, because when most people hit the exits, they're not hitting the exit, they're actually stepping somewhere else in the network. There are people that make dramatic career changes. Most people, though, when they leave to go somewhere else in our industry, in our sector. They leave to go somewhere else in the giant network that is our industry. And so we might fear that they're going to take all of their information and they're going to bring it to our competitor. But a lot of the studies show it actually goes the opposite way too. That information flows, especially innovation, we can track it in patent filings. When someone leaves one organization and goes to the next, yes, their patents start referencing the patents of this firm. But the same thing happens the other way. This firm actually gets an increase in knowledge and in intellectual capital because they're learning things from this firm, because they've left that connection in place. And so treating people like they're somewhere in the network, that whether they go to another company, a vendor, a client, a partner, a straight competitor, they're somewhere else in the network, becomes hugely important. And the research supports this. And in social science literature, we talk about 2 different types of network ties. You've probably interacted with both today, probably did it during the networking break, and if you don't, please do it at lunch. We talk about close-knit ties and arm's-length connections. Close-knit ties are largely our friends, family, the people who work with us, the people that we see every single day, and arm's-length connections are the people that we keep at an arm's length. It's a pretty original title. This is what you get when you're working with sociologists. And what turns out when you look at study individuals' career success and also the survivability of firms. I mean, I love this idea of innovation and what the future of work looks like and what the future of technology looks like, but if we're out of business, we're out of business. So let's start with survivability of firms. And you find that it's the companies that balance this connection, arm's length and close-knit, that have the highest rates of survivability, and individuals at the highest rates of performance. And this is why a lot of firms, I'm just going to sort of run through them really quick, like LinkedIn, have an alumni network, a system they use to keep in track with people who have left the firm. Theirs actually works on 2 tiers. The first tier is all-inclusive, arm's length. Anybody who left without being invited to be successful somewhere else is invited into this all-inclusive tier. And then there's a closer tier of people who are either higher up in the firm or are really valuable in the alumni network. They get invited into the inner circle to become a close-knit tie. Makes sense that this would be LinkedIn, by the way, because a lot of companies' alumni networks exist on LinkedIn. So they've got a pretty good pool to study from. One of my favorites is actually the consulting firm Accenture. Accenture they have an online portal. They have this sort of talent pool that helps former employees find new jobs. They also offer former employees the same employee referral bonus as current employees. In other words, when you leave the firm, if you find someone who would be a good fit for Accenture, we'll still pay you a couple grand if we end up hiring them. Which makes perfect sense because you know exactly what a good fit at Accenture looks like, and now you're swimming in a sea of people who don't work for us, so you're going to have more people who might be prospective employees. It's a brilliant idea. There's real value in celebrating departures and making sure that farewells don't become a mere see you later. You might not be able to create an entire alumni network, but when someone leaves, your most important question is, how are we going to stay in touch? And if somebody's already left, have you reached out to them lately? It might be as simple as just setting up a regular lunch every once in a while with some of the former people on your team. Now, at this point, we've covered a lot of different information. We've covered a lot of different trends, and I believe some of them represent the future of work. The future's already here. It's just not evenly dispersed. If there's an industry and a sector that knows this, right, that the future is already here, it's just not evenly dispersed, it's us, right? And when I think about this, one of the dominant questions we get often is, why do I have to do this? Why do I have to close open offices, abandon performance appraisals? Why do I have to hire as a team? What we're doing now is working. I hear this a lot, and I respond the same way every time. My mind goes to the internal combustion engine. I'm a bit of a nerd. I apologize. The internal combustion engine. I took a class in physics in college once, and one of the few things I remember was that the internal combustion engine is only 30% efficient. That's not miles per gallon, that's 30% of the energy that's stored in gasoline gets translated into forward motion. And if you look about it, Jason referenced Elon Musk. Jason and I were actually both hanging out at the TED conference, and he mentioned Elon Musk said before the end of 2017, a battery-powered car will travel from Los Angeles to New York completely autonomously with no driver. I think it'll probably have to stop to refill the battery, but I love the autonomy part, right? And when we think about the battery is an attempt to get more energy translated into forward motion. Organizations ought to be having the same conversations. The fuel running most organizations isn't what Frederick Taylor thought. It's not brute labor anymore, it's mental energy. And so we have to look at how are we capturing the mental energy of our employees. One of the number one ways to track that is employee engagement, a measure of how much of a full focus, a full self, a full energy, how much of a person's whole being can they be at work. And the numbers aren't all that good. Worldwide, over the last 40 years, employee engagement sat at 18%. 18% of the potential in employees is getting captured into value for the organization. US, it's a little better, but it actually ties with the internal combustion engine. And now we think about this quote from the very beginning, that great leaders don't innovate the product, they innovate the factory. Everything I've told you about today is an experiment, just like a Tesla experiment with cars, just like the people who experiment with different engines. It's an experiment to try and figure out how do we get more mental energy and make the workplace better. Now, I think about this often because I have two boys. They're 5 and 3. And when I think about 3 out of 10 or 2 out of 10 people being fully engaged, I think that's really depressing if we don't do something for my kids. Right? It's unacceptable to think they have a 2 out of 10 chance of finding a job that leverages them. I mean, if we get it to 50% and one boy's happy, that'd be all. No, I'm just kidding. But if it's unacceptable then, it's unacceptable now, right? If it's unacceptable in the future for future employees, it's unacceptable now for our own ones. Great leaders don't just innovate the product, they innovate the factory. My challenge to you is this. What are you going to do to start innovating the factory you have control of, to start harnessing more mental energy and turning it into more value? Great leaders don't just innovate the product, they innovate the factory. So how are we going to innovate the factory today? Thank you all so much.